In December 2007, in the Grand Hall of Oslo City Hall, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded. The cameras were there. The world was watching. The speeches were long, the applause sustained, and the moment was, by any measure, historic. In Warsaw, a 97-year-old woman watched from her apartment. She did not attend the ceremony. She had not been invited. Between 1942 and 1943, Irena Sendler smuggled approximately 2,500 children out of the Warsaw Ghetto. She did this while working as a social worker under Nazi occupation at the risk of her own life. She was eventually caught, tortured, and sentenced to death. She survived. She kept doing the work. This is not a story about a woman who deserved an award. This is a story about what it means when the world almost erases someone entirely. Irena Stanislawa Sendler was born on February 15, 1910, in Warsaw, then part of the Russian Empire. Her father was a doctor who treated patients others refused, including Jewish patients, at a time when that required both moral clarity and personal courage. He died of typhus when Irena was 7 years old, contracted from a patient he refused to abandon. Before he died, he told his daughter one thing that she would carry for the rest of her life. He told her, "If you see someone drowning, you must jump in the water, even if you cannot swim." She remembered that. She studied at the University of Warsaw in the late 1920s. She was politically active, a member of socialist student organizations, and she was suspended from the university for protesting the segregated seating that forced Jewish students to sit separately from other students. She accepted the suspension without apology. Through the 1930s, she worked for the Warsaw Social Welfare Department, distributing food, clothing, and money to families in need. She was known for falsifying documents to include Jewish families who were otherwise excluded from receiving aid. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Warsaw was bombed for weeks. The city was occupied. The rules of daily life were rewritten overnight, and most of the new rules were designed to make Jewish survival impossible. In October 1940, the Nazis established the Warsaw Ghetto, a walled district in the center of the city where 400,000 Jews were forcibly relocated. The walls were 3 meters high. The rations inside were designed to produce starvation. Typhus spread through the overcrowded streets. People died in doorways, in alleys, in the arms of their families. The ghetto was not a place of containment. It was a place of slow and deliberate death. Irena Sendler was 30 years old. She worked for the city's social welfare department. She had an official badge that allowed her to enter the ghetto to inspect sanitary conditions. In 1941, she obtained a special pass, officially to inspect for typhus, to control the spread of disease. The Nazis gave her access because they feared epidemic more than they trusted their own regulations. She used that pass to go in every day. She went in every day. What she found inside the ghetto was a population that had been stripped of everything: food, space, legal status, the right to exist. The children were the most visible victims. They begged on the streets. They smuggled scraps through holes in the wall. They starved in their parents' arms while their parents watched, unable to help. She began making a different kind of offer. Not food, not medicine, something harder. She would take their children out. The methods she used were not glamorous. They were practical and desperate. Children were hidden in toolboxes, in potato sacks, in coffins, in ambulances, under stretchers, inside luggage. Infants were sedated and carried out in bags. Older children were coached to walk calmly, to not cry, to pretend they were someone else. Each smuggling required preparation, coordination, risk at every step, and the willingness of parents to hand their child to a stranger who might or might not get them out alive. She did not do this alone. She worked with a network of Polish citizens, members of an underground organization called Zegota, the Council to Aid Jews, and a group of trusted colleagues who shared the risk, the work, and the danger equally. Many of them were women. None of them were famous. Each child who came out of the ghetto was given a new identity, a new name, a new family, a new history. They were placed with Polish families, in convents, in orphanages, wherever they could be hidden and kept alive. The problem, and Irena Sendler understood this from the beginning, was that a child who forgets their name loses something irreplaceable. If the war ended, if any of this worked, the children would need to know who they were. She kept records. She wrote every child's real name on a small piece of paper, along with the name they had been given and where they had been placed. She put these papers in glass jars. She buried the jars in the garden of a trusted friend under an apple tree in a yard on the outskirts of Warsaw. Every name, every child, every hiding place, buried in the ground. The idea was that when the war ended, if the war ended, she would dig up the jars, find the papers, and use the names to reunite the children with whatever family remained. She did not know yet what she would find when she dug them up. By the time the deportations to Treblinka began in the summer of 1942, 300,000 Jews had been removed from the ghetto to the death camps. The parents who had given their children to Irena Sendler had made their choice already. They knew what the deportations meant. The hardest part, the part she spoke about in later interviews, again and again, for the rest of her life, was the moment of separation. The moment when a parent handed their child to her, knowing they might never see them again, knowing that handing them over was the only way to save them. She said that she carried the weight of those moments every day. She said that she never once felt like a hero. She said she felt only that she had not done enough, that she should have done more. On October 20th, 1943, the Gestapo came for her. They arrived at 4 in the morning. They searched her apartment. They found lists, not the main lists, which were already buried, but enough. They arrested her and took her to Pawiak prison, the Gestapo detention center in Warsaw, where prisoners were interrogated and rarely left intact. Over the following weeks, they broke her legs. They broke her feet. They tortured her systematically, trying to extract names, locations, the identities of the children, the addresses of the hiding places. She gave them nothing, not one name, not one address. She had buried the jars specifically so that the knowledge could not be beaten out of her, because she knew that she might be caught, and she did not trust herself to endure everything. She was sentenced to death. On the day of her scheduled execution, the members of Zegota bribed the guards. She was taken from the prison, her name was added to the list of the executed, and she was left on the street with broken legs and a new identity. She disappeared into the city. She continued her work. After the war, in the spring of 1945, she went back to the garden. She dug up the jars. The papers were intact. Every name, every location, every record she had buried before her arrest. 2,500 names. She took the papers to the Jewish Central Committee. She began the work of trying to find the children, now hidden in families and institutions across Poland, and reunite them with whoever had survived. Most of the families were gone. The parents who had handed their children to Irena Sendler had been deported to Treblinka. The grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, most of them had not survived. The children she had saved came back to find that there was no one left to come back to. She had saved their lives. She could not give them back what they had lost. She spent years doing this work, quietly, without recognition, without awards. She was, in many ways, a person the post-war world had no particular use for, a Catholic Pole who had risked everything for Jewish children, in a country that had complicated feelings about that history and preferred, in many cases, not to discuss it. For decades, almost no one outside a small circle in Poland knew her name. In 1999, 4 students at a high school in Uniontown, Kansas, decided to do a history project. Their teacher suggested they look into the Holocaust. They wanted to find a story that hadn't been told. Someone gave them a reference to an obscure newsletter article that mentioned a Polish woman named Irena Sendler who had saved children from the Warsaw Ghetto. The 4 students began to research. They found almost nothing. A few paragraphs, a passing reference in a single book, a name without a face, without a story, without a biography. They assumed she must be dead. She was 90 years old. They assumed the story was over. They wrote her a letter. She wrote back. The students turned their research into a play. They called it Life in a Jar, a reference to the buried records. They performed it for their school, then for their town, then for audiences across Kansas, across the United States. Word spread. Journalists found the story. Documentary filmmakers came. The Polish government took notice. The Israeli government took notice. A woman who had spent 60 years in near-total obscurity became, in her 90s, internationally known. Irena Sendler was 93 years old when she finally received sustained international attention. She gave interviews from her apartment in Warsaw. She was gracious and clear-eyed and utterly unwilling to accept the word hero. She said it again and again. I could have done more. I could have saved more children. I didn't do enough. In 2003, the Polish government awarded her the Order of the White Eagle, the highest honor the country bestows. She was 93 years old. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She was 97 years old and living in a nursing home in Warsaw, too frail to travel but entirely lucid, entirely present, entirely herself. The Nobel Peace Prize for 2007 was awarded to Al Gore and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for their work on raising awareness of climate change. There is nothing wrong with climate change awareness. There is nothing wrong with the Nobel Committee's choice. These things can coexist. This is simply what happened. The committee made its decision, and the woman who had smuggled 2,500 children out of a death camp did not win. Irena Sendler pulled children out of a death camp with her bare hands. She was tortured until her legs were broken. She carried 2,500 names in a jar buried in the ground. She spent 60 years in obscurity and refused at the end to accept the word hero. She did not win. She did not win. On May 12, 2008, Irena Sendler died in Warsaw. She was 98 years old. In her obituary in the New York Times, she was described as a woman who had saved more Jews than Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler had a movie. The children she saved, now elderly, scattered across Europe and Israel and the United States, had not known, for most of their lives, that they had been saved. They had grown up with false names, false histories, in families that were not their own, in a world that gave them no framework for understanding what had happened to them. Some of them never knew. They lived entire lives without knowing that their name was written on a piece of paper, buried in a jar, under an apple tree in Warsaw. Some of them found out. Some of them met her before she died. Some of them held her hand and said thank you, and she held their hand and said I should have done more. That was who she was. That was the only self-evaluation she would accept. She kept the records because she believed the children had a right to know their own names. She believed identity was not a luxury. She believed that the act of erasing someone, their name, their history, their origin, was its own kind of violence, even when the erasure was done with love, even when the erasure was the only way to keep them alive. She was right. The Nobel Committee has its criteria. The history books have their hierarchies. The world has its preferences for certain kinds of stories over others, stories with visible drama, famous names, institutional recognition. Irena Sendler had none of those things for most of her life. Irena Sendler saved 2,500 children. She was tortured for it. She was almost executed for it. She was almost forgotten for it. Her name was almost buried, too. Every week on this channel we find one name, one person, one story, someone whose name almost disappeared from history through deliberate erasure, through institutional silence, through the world's preference for other stories. We say the name. We tell the story. That is the only thing we can do. This has been The Erased.